What if there was a psalm, written 3,000 years ago by a shepherd who became a king, that Jewish communities across every century of exile and hardship read specifically in moments of financial crisis? A psalm that rabbis prescribed not merely as prayer, but as a spiritual technology, a precise, deliberate practice. 3 days, morning and evening, with full attention and understanding. And what if the reason it worked had nothing to do with superstition, and everything to do with the ancient wisdom encoded inside its words? Today, I am going to share with you which psalm this is, why the sages prescribed it, and what the 3-day practice actually does to the mind, the spirit, and, as generations of witnesses have testified, to the circumstances of those who practice it with sincerity. There is a psalm that has been whispered in the darkest rooms of Jewish history, in the homes of merchants who had lost everything, in the small apartments of immigrants who had arrived with nothing, in the hearts of men and women who owed more than they could see any way of repaying. It is not a psalm that promises magic. The Torah does not deal in magic. It deals in law, spiritual law, the deep, invisible structure of how the universe responds to human consciousness and human action. This psalm is a key to that law. And today, for the first time perhaps, you will understand why. Stay with me, because what I am about to share has been passed from rabbi to student, from generation to generation, in one of the most resilient traditions the world has ever known. We begin in the year 1648, in the city of Nemirov, in what is now Ukraine. The Cossack massacres, known in Jewish memory as the Gezerot Tachvatat, had devastated hundreds of Jewish communities across Poland and the Ukraine. Tens of thousands were killed. Communities that had flourished for generations were obliterated in weeks. Survivors fled with nothing. No possessions, no savings, no homes, no community structures to return to. In one such shattered community, a rabbi named Reb Eliezer gathered the survivors, perhaps 40, perhaps 50 souls, in a cellar beneath the ruins of what had been the synagogue. It was past midnight. There was little food. There were many debts. Debts to non-Jewish neighbors who had hidden some of these people at personal risk, debts for supplies purchased before the catastrophe that now could not be repaid, debts that hung over the survivors like a second darkness layered over the first. One of the men in that cellar, a merchant named Avigdor, spoke aloud what many were thinking in silence. "Rabbi," he said, "I understand grief. I understand rebuilding. I have rebuilt before, but I do not know how to rebuild under the weight of what I owe. Every time I think of beginning again, I feel the debt first. It sits on my chest like a stone. I cannot breathe through it." The others nodded. Several wept quietly. Reb Eliezer looked at them for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised them. He smiled, not the smile of a man dismissing their pain, but the smile of a man who recognized something. As if the question Avigdor had asked was one he had been waiting for. "I am going to teach you something tonight," the rabbi said quietly. "Something that has been in our hands since King David walked the hills of Judea. A practice that is not for times of comfort. It was written specifically for times like this one, for moments when the debt feels heavier than the hope." He opened his worn Tehillim, his book of Psalms, to a page he knew without needing to count. His fingers were already there. "We are going to read this psalm together," he said. "Tonight, tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening, the following morning, the following evening, and on the morning of the 3rd day, 6 times. And between each reading, I am going to teach you what it means. Not merely the words, the structure, the architecture of what David built inside this psalm, because this psalm is not simply a prayer, it is a map. And if you understand the map, you will know where you are and where you are going." The psalm he opened to was Psalm 112. Let me tell you what is inside it. Psalm 112 is one of the great acrostic psalms of the Hebrew Bible. It is constructed with extraordinary precision. each verse beginning with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet, from Aleph to Tav. This is not literary decoration. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the use of all 22 Hebrew letters, the complete alphabet, represents completeness, wholeness, a statement that encompasses the full range of reality from beginning to end. The psalm opens with the words, Hallelujah! Happy is the one who fears God, who delights greatly in his commandments. The word translated as happy, ashrei, is better rendered as deeply, fundamentally fortunate, rooted in a happiness that does not depend on circumstances, the kind of happiness that does not require things to go well in order to exist. And immediately, from the very first verse, the psalm establishes its central premise. This fortune is not random, it is not luck. It flows from a particular orientation toward life, toward the sacred, toward the commandments, toward the structure of right relationship with the world. The second verse speaks of the person's descendants. Their children will be mighty in the land. A generation of upright people will be blessed. The rabbis interpreted this not merely literally, though they did not dismiss the literal meaning, but as a teaching about legacy, about the long arc of a life lived in integrity. The debts of one generation, faced with courage and honesty, become the foundations of the next generation's strength. The third verse is the one that stopped every merchant who ever read this psalm in a moment of financial crisis. Wealth and abundance are in his house, and his righteousness endures forever. Osher va osher biveto. Wealth and abundance in his house. 3,000 years ago, the shepherd king David looked up at the stars over Judea and wrote those words not as a promise of divine magic, but as an observation about a spiritual law. Wealth and abundance, he wrote, are in the house of the person whose righteousness endures. Note the sequence, note the architecture. It is not, first come the riches, and then perhaps righteousness will follow. It is the opposite. The righteousness is the foundation. The integrity is the root. And from that root, reliably over time, with the steady patience of a tree growing rather than the sudden drama of a lottery, wealth and abundance come. The fourth verse, light dawns in the darkness for the upright, for the one who is gracious, compassionate, and just. Light in darkness. This verse was read in that cellar in Nemirov with tears, because they were in darkness, literal and metaphorical, and the psalm was telling them, the light is not coming from outside your situation. It is coming from the qualities you carry inside it. Grace, compassion, justice. These are not merely virtues. They are, the psalm teaches, the mechanism by which light is generated in dark circumstances. The fifth verse, good comes to the person who is gracious and lends, who conducts their affairs with justice. This verse electrified Reb Eliezer's listeners in that cellar, because it speaks directly to the economics of debt, not with shame, but with dignity. The person who conducts their affairs, even in crisis, even under pressure, with justice. This, the psalm says, is the person to whom good comes, not eventually, not after a miraculous reversal, but as a natural and reliable consequence of how they show up in their dealings. The sixth verse, for the righteous will never be moved, they will be remembered forever. The Hebrew word for never be moved, lo yimot, carries the idea of not being shaken from one's foundation. Not that nothing difficult will happen, not that no storm will come, but that the righteous person will not be uprooted by the storm. Their root holds. And the 7th and 8th verses bring us to the emotional core of the psalm. They will not fear bad news. Their heart is firm, trusting in God. Their heart is steady. They will not be afraid. They will not fear bad news. Anyone who has lived under debt knows this fear intimately. The checking of the phone before opening an email, the dreading of the knock at the door, the way the mind runs ahead into every worst-case scenario. This fear, the psalm teaches, is not merely an emotional experience, it is a spiritual posture, and it can be changed, not through denial or false positivity, but through the cultivation of the firm heart, the steady heart, the heart that trusts in a source deeper than the circumstances it currently faces. The 9th verse returns to generosity. They have given freely to the poor. Their righteousness endures forever. Their power is exalted in honor. The psalm returns to giving, not as a side note, but as a structural element of its architecture, appearing near the beginning and again near the end, as if David is saying, "This principle is so central that I need to say it twice." You cannot read this psalm carefully without encountering the call to generosity as a load-bearing column of the entire teaching. The 10th and final verse describes the contrast the entire psalm has been building toward. The wicked person sees it and is infuriated. They gnash their teeth and melt away. Prosperity built on integrity is, in the deepest sense, unassailable. It cannot be stolen or undermined because it is not located in the external things that can be taken away. It is located in the person's relationship with the source of all provision. This is what Reb Eliezer taught in that cellar, not in one sitting. Over 3 days, morning and evening, reading the psalm, then teaching 1 or 2 verses, then sitting in silence with it, then reading again. And this is what I want to teach you now, how to practice this psalm as the tradition intends. The 3-day practice is not simply the reading of a text. It is a structured process of inner work, designed to move a person through 3 distinct stages of transformation. The ancient rabbis understood, with extraordinary psychological precision, that the human mind cannot make deep changes in a single day. Change requires repetition. It requires approach and retreat. It requires the integration of sleep, of rest, of the unconscious processing that happens between conscious engagements. On the first day, you read Psalm 1 to 12 slowly, ideally aloud, in a quiet space, in the morning before the day's activities begin, and again in the evening before sleep. The purpose of the first day is simply to hear it, to let the words land without analysis or pressure, to allow your defenses to soften, because most people who are living under debt and financial anxiety have unconsciously built a kind of inner fortress against the very feelings they most need to access: fear, shame, grief, and beneath all of those, hope. The first day's reading is an invitation to begin to lower the walls. On the second day, you read more slowly. You pause at each verse and ask, what is the specific quality this verse is calling me toward? Where in my current situation is this quality most needed and most absent? The second day is the day of honest examination, not punishment, not shame, but clear-eyed recognition. The psalm becomes a mirror. The merchant in Nemirov who read it on the second day and paused at verse 5, the verse about conducting affairs with justice, recognized where fear had quietly compromised his integrity, not dramatically, but in the small ways that accumulate, the invoice not clarified, the arrangement left ambiguous, the difficult conversation avoided. On the third day, the reading becomes a commitment. You carry with you what you saw on the second day. You are not reading about someone else. You are reading about the person you are choosing to become. Each verse becomes a declaration of intent. The firm heart, the light in darkness, the generosity that endures. On the evening of the third day, after the final reading, the tradition prescribes one additional practice. You write, not to God, and not in the form of prayer. You write, in your own words, one concrete commitment, one specific change in how you will conduct your financial affairs in the coming week, one act of financial integrity that you have been avoiding, one gesture of generosity, however small, that you have been postponing. And then you sign it with your name the way a person signs a contract. Because in the Jewish legal tradition, the written commitment, the Shtar, carries a weight The unwritten intention does not. It moves something from the world of thought into the world of action. This is the 3-day practice as Reb Eliezer taught it in Nemirov. Now let us speak of why it works, not in mystical terms, though the mystical dimension is real and worthy of respect, but in terms of the spiritual law that underlies it. The central teaching of Psalm 112 is this: the relationship between righteousness and prosperity is not accidental. It is a present, operative, structural connection. Righteousness, integrity in dealings, generosity to those in need, a steady heart that does not collapse into fear, creates the conditions through which abundance naturally flows. When a person lives in fear of bad news, their capacity for creative action contracts. Their relationships with customers, partners, creditors become tinged with the anxiety they carry, and others feel it. The feared outcome becomes more likely through the entirely natural mechanism of how a frightened, desperate person tends to interact with the world. When a person cultivates the firm heart the psalm describes, their capacity for action expands. They perceive their situation with greater clarity. They bring grace and justice to their dealings, and others respond to that quality. New possibilities open, not because the external situation has changed, but because the internal lens has. The 3-day structure accelerates this. By returning to the psalm 6 times over 72 hours, the practitioner interrupts the cycle of fearful thinking at the depth where it operates. Sleep between readings allows the unconscious to work. The morning reading catches the mind before the day's anxieties mount. The evening reading brings the teachings into the night, where the deepest integration happens. The written commitment at the end transforms internal work into external reality, which is precisely where the debts live and where the changes must ultimately land. Reb Eliezer's community in Nemirov practiced this together over 3 days in that cellar. When they emerged, they did not emerge into a world where their debts had vanished. The material reality was unchanged, but something in the people themselves had shifted, in ways that those who were present described years later as the turning point. The moment they stopped being defined by what they owed and began to be defined again by who they were. The merchant Avigdor, who had spoken of the debt sitting on his chest like a stone, went to his largest creditor 3 days later, a non-Jewish landowner who had given him grain on credit before the catastrophe. He went not to negotiate, not to offer excuses, but simply to speak honestly. Here is what I have. Here is what I do not have. Here is my commitment for how I will repay what I owe and over what timeline, and here is my word, which I give you as a man of Torah, which means it stands above any contract. The landowner, who had expected flight or deception or elaborate justification, sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said something that Avigdor told his children, and his children told theirs. I have given credit to many men. You are the first who ever came to me like this. Take the time you need. That is the teaching of Psalm 112. That is the practice of 3 days. Not a magic formula, not a miraculous cancellation of debt, but the cultivation of the internal qualities, the firm heart, the gracious dealing, the commitment to justice in all affairs, through which the path forward becomes visible, through which creditors become human beings again rather than threats, through which opportunities emerge from the fog of fear, through which the person in debt becomes, once more, the person of integrity they were before the debt defined them. If this teaching has reached you at a moment of difficulty, if you are reading this carrying a weight of financial fear, of debt, of uncertainty about the road ahead, then I want to speak to you directly and plainly. Read Psalm 112, 3 days, morning and evening, slowly, not as a ritual performed for divine favor, but as an act of deep, honest engagement with the wisdom it carries. Let it show you where you are. Let it show you who you want to be. Let it ask of you the one specific act of financial integrity or generosity that you already know somewhere inside you, needs to happen. And on the evening of the third day, write it down, sign your name, make it real. The debts may not disappear overnight. The psalm does not promise that. But the person who emerges from those 3 days, if the practice is done with genuine honesty and attention, is a different person than the one who began it. And a different person relates differently to debt, to creditors, to opportunity, to the source of provision. That difference is where everything begins. Subscribe to this channel. Each week, I bring you another piece of this extraordinary inheritance, the wisdom of Torah, the depth of Jewish tradition, the spiritual practices that have carried Jewish communities through every form of darkness the world has offered, into lives of meaning, integrity, and enduring abundance. And in the comments below, tell me, have you ever read a psalm in a moment of crisis and felt something shift? Or is this the first time you are hearing of this practice? Your story matters. This community is built on shared wisdom, because wisdom carried alone is wisdom half-lived. Wisdom shared becomes the inheritance of a generation. Shalom.